This is microeconomics. We're on chapter 10, and we'll be talking about externalities. Well, at the beginning of the book, even in chapter 1, your author says that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. If you just leave it up to the interaction between buyers and sellers. But then right after that, the next principle that we learned in chapter 1, it said that sometimes governments can help market outcomes. In order for markets to work, we assume several things, and we can get to market failure if some of those assumptions are met. One, if there are positive or negative externalities that we'll talk about today, or if someone has too much market power. And we'll talk about different market structures later. But, again, going back to what we've talked about in the previous chapters, for the government to actually get involved, they need tax revenue to do it. And then we've seen that taxes distort the market, shrinks the market, and there's some deadweight loss there. So there are trade-offs. But in this chapter, we're looking at how positive and negative externalities might warrant some government interactions to improve outcomes. So as they said in the DVD, an externality, you can see the word external here. There's either a positive or negative consequence that's external to the decision maker, to whoever was involved in the market transaction, on some innocent bystander. And it could be, good or bad. And we could think of examples here on the next slide. If you've ever had to sit at a red light behind someone who hasn't changed their it looks like they haven't changed their motor oil in years, that's a negative externality for you having to smell that. Positive externalities, so better technologies, new, faster microchips that can benefit all of us, or a cure for cancer, a new immunization that can eradicate a disease that's going to benefit a lot of us. So the people who are doing that research, or the people who are deciding, do I want to get my car maintained or not, sometimes just think about themselves. They're not thinking about how it's going to affect everyone else around them. And, if we say the role of the government is to, maybe protect the bystanders, then that could be a possible argument for the government to get involved here when externalities are involved. All right. Well, market failure is when we just leave it up to the market interaction between buyers and sellers, and we just don't get to the best outcome. And one cause of that can be because of externalities. And just a recap, we know that the demand curve represents what buyers are willing and able to pay, represents the value of that product or service to buyers at every price. And the supply curve represents, the cost, you can think of it as the cost of production to suppliers. And we want to maximize those two. Or we want to maximize producer and consumer surplus. So our first example, your author talks about producing aluminum. So aluminum, we've got foil. Everybody's probably got that in your apartment or house. But we use it in a lot of other products too. If we just left it up to the market, so representing the value of aluminum to consumers at every price, that's the demand curve, and this is the cost of production to our aluminum producers at every price. Right there's equilibrium. But what if this quantity of aluminum that is produced led to a whole bunch of pollution in the air? So when aluminum is produced, of course, there's going to be some pollution that's going to be in the air that we breathe. And what if the Environmental Protection Agency said this is too much pollution? Well, it's hard because the aluminum producer, all they're thinking about is, the costs that make up their supply curve, right? Their labor, their materials, their costs of production. They are not thinking about the damage to everyone else's health. They're not thinking about how many particles are in the air that's going to be released because of their production. And so if you look at, just like he did, you can calculate it with the cost to everybody in the classroom with the minutes on someone's cell phone in terms of how many minutes he's disrupting the class. You could, calculate in the community how many people have higher medical costs, asthma, having to go to the doctor. And if you take a look at that, because of that pollution from producing aluminum, the cost of society is much larger than just the cost of production that the aluminum businesses are thinking about, right? That they're making their production decisions on. So the social cost, or the total cost, is actually much higher than just the private costs of the producers. So the social costs, or the new supply curve that we're going to look at, is equal to the private costs of the aluminum producers plus those negative externalities. So in this case, it might be higher medical costs for people maybe getting sick, respiratory infections or asthma from breathing in more pollution. So the social cost curve is actually here, this red line. So again,
how do they quantify the social cost?
Again, just like they did in the video, if they were to calculate, tuition down to the minutes and then multiply by how many people were affected. And so if we were to theoretically look at a community or city and look at before the aluminum producer came in and then higher health costs after they start polluting, you could, divide it out by
measurable ways to quantify the value.
Yes. So that would be equal to the external cost that Dan was asking about, and that's going to shift. What your author is saying is that when the aluminum company just thinks about their own cost of production, this is the supply curve that they have in their mind. But if you add into the costs of pollution, higher medical costs to society, it's actually way over here. So for them to actually think about these external costs, the government's going to have to do something. Otherwise, they're just going to be thinking about labor, electricity, and their machinery and things like that. And so for them to actually think about these external costs, there's going to have to be some kind of government intervention in terms of a fine or a limit on pollution, something like that, in order for them to think about these external costs and then make their decisions based on this red supply curve rather than just the blue one. And that, as you all know, leads to a new equilibrium, and then we'd have fewer units of aluminum produced. That would be better for that community.
So the EPA is an externality controller for the United States government.
They are probably just, I would say that they're measuring, and they're the ones that we rely on to come up with what is healthy, what is a healthy level of amount of pollution in the air, and it's their job to measure that too. Okay, so in order to get aluminum companies and other manufacturing factories to think about, this higher social cost curve, what we're going to have to do is get them to, and this is the wording that your author uses, internalize the externality. That means get companies to think about the negative costs of, releasing all this pollution out into the air. And we can do that, like I said, by altering incentives such as taxing them by that amount. Okay, so remember, with negative externalities, like pollution, what are we trying to do? We know that it's going to harm a lot of people in the environment. We've talked about the movie Erin Brockovich. Actually, the real Erin Brockovich was in the news lately. I don't know if y'all saw that. But in the movie, as I think Gregory remembered, lots and lots of pollution into the water and lots of people getting tumors and cancer, and it was it was just cheaper for them. If you just leave it up to the market, they're just thinking about their costs of, maximizing profit, and it's cheaper for them to just dump it rather than dispose of it properly. So that's what businesses are going to do. And this is an argument for the government to step in and get them to think about those external costs, and then they would produce less aluminum or pollute less also. All right, with positive externalities. An example of a positive externality might be education, or it might be an immunization. If someone stays healthy, then the rest of the people they come into contact with are going to benefit too. When you get your education, you might be able to get a higher paying job, higher standard of living for yourself, your family. If you've got the skills that benefit your employer benefits, your community benefits, and so on and so forth. So if you've got, even on a societal level, if you have an educated population, educated citizens, they can read and make educated decisions about who they elect to government. You could argue that the whole country would be better off with education. But, as you all know, going to college, or even K through 12, and that's provided by the government, but higher levels of education, it's not cheap, right? You have to pay for it. That has to come from somewhere. And so the private value of, just us as individuals, can I afford education? If you just looked at that at different price levels, that's going to make up the private value demand curve that we start out with. But if we say that it's beneficial for a lot of people in this country or community, whatever we're talking about, to be educated, then we want that demand curve to be shifted out further. Right? We want more people to be in college. And so the social value of how we value education is actually above just that private line. Okay, so if you just left it up to people's own incomes, no federal aid or anything like that, this is the demand for education. Or for going to college, you could think of. And this many people would go to college. Now, if we were to measure the benefit of having, an educated workforce, a lot of people contributing to society, etc., and could somehow quantify that benefit to our community, it would shift the demand curve out to the right. I know it says up on the previous slide, but up or to the right. And we should be looking at now this curve. So this is why the government has Pell Grants and subsidized federal loans, and why, and actually private foundations and companies giving scholarships too, to try to increase the number of people going to college, because that would benefit all of us. Does anyone know what a low jack is? Yeah, what is it? Yeah.
It's a piece of electronic that goes inside of your car, and if a car is stolen, the company can turn it on and identify with GPS exactly the exact location of it.
Yeah. My dad bought a new car a few years ago, and it's a great time to sell a low jack when you're buying your new car, because, it wasn't new, but we bought it at the dealership, and, really, it's a good time for them to, scare you and say, you want to make sure that if anybody steals your car, we'll be able to find it. But they came to our house, and it was really secretive. We weren't allowed to watch them. They installed it after we bought it from the dealership, so they sent them out to our house, and they put it in a secret location of our car, somewhere where we didn't know. And, fortunately, we haven't ever had to use it. But these economists took a look at the positive externalities from the low jack. And they were saying that some types of crime prevention measures, like if you have a little blinking light on your car, it looks like an alarm, but it really isn't. So somebody who's trying to steal your car might see that blinking light and think, oh, well, they've got an alarm, I'm just going to go somewhere else. And so these economists said that just redistributes crime. It doesn't actually reduce it. And he said that they say that low jacks actually reduce the crime because, like Dan said, if your car gets stolen, the police can activate it, and then it's like a little GPS system, and then they can find the precision and track the movements, and they can find the chop shop where your stolen car is, and probably where a lot of other stolen cars are, return all those back to the owners, and arrest everybody who's part of that theft ring, put them all in jail. And they were thinking that, let's see, the benefit to the car owner plus the spillover benefit to other car owners in the community is 15 times greater than the marginal cost of the service. And they're saying that 90% of the total benefit is completely external to other car owners in the community, and they argue that the levels of insurance discounts are way too small to, compared to the positive externalities created by a low jack. So that's another example. So remember, with positive externalities, the government can correct this, if we just left it up to the market, there's going to be an under-allocation. If you just had to pay for college yourself, there would be fewer of us going. And so you can argue that the government can step in and maybe provide a subsidy or subsidized loans, for example, and then we can see a greater number of people getting education. Okay.
Well, if that's true, then why are we seeing more pullback on that theory? Because there's a lot of people, if you watch the news, they're complaining that the cost of tuition is now past the average, the median, and therefore, by the government subsidies, it's actually creating a negative externality in a sense that there's too much student loan debt now. And the fact that the costs are getting past, shall we say, the average ability to go.
Right.
So where's the cutoff, I guess?
Well, that's a good point too. I can bring in some different articles. You have to be smart about how many loans you do take out. Now, loans are a great way if you don't have any other way to go to college. It's just one option. It's to give you that opportunity to. But you also have to be smart about how much you take out, which degree you're going for, and look at the job market for those who have the positions that hire your degree that you have, and I'm just going to say you have to be smart about that. You can argue that the government should or shouldn't provide those kinds of loans. Are they providing more of a problem or not? But you yourself have to be smart. Let's see here. Okay, so this is just summing up what we were talking about with negative externalities. If we just left them alone, markets generally produce a larger quantity. This is like aluminum. That's socially desirable. If we just left it alone, markets tend to produce a smaller quantity that's socially desirable. We're talking about something like education. And the government can come in to correct both of these things. They could. Another example of a positive externality is better technology. So not only will it help other industries, but all of us, if we've got a example of a faster microchip processor, and so an example of trying to promote discoveries and inventions of new technologies is giving the inventor a patent. So they have that profit incentive for a certain number of years that they're the only ones who can sell that invention. All right, so policies. What can the government do in order to correct for for these externalities and try to get us to that best outcome. We said that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, could come up with a rule. We could say this is the amount of pollution that we think is acceptable for people's health, and we could say no polluting, or this is the only amount that you can pollute. So having some kind of rule, or in the DVD, he said a lot of schools have this rule of no cell phones. Just having what we mean by command and control policies, we're just regulating. There's some kind of rule there. We're telling people what to do, or making a limit. Or instead of command and control policies, we can have another option. Like the professor did with the student, by making him pay a tax, making him pay $1.50. And so this is not you can't pollute. It's you can't, if you do pollute, you're going to have to pay a penalty. So this is a little bit different in terms of a corrective tax. And really, you can think of it as a price on the right to pollute. So you can pollute, but you're just going to have to pay a penalty. And economists actually prefer this to just flat out regulation because it provides an incentive not to. Instead of just telling them don't do this, you're providing an incentive not to because they don't want to give up that money.
So they must have the tax where it costs more than it would to.
Absolutely, yeah. The incentive structure needs to definitely be set up correct if you want the behavior to follow what you're trying to do. And one example was gasoline tax. So we've got all these negative externalities associated with a bunch of cars on the road. And if you wanted to reduce those things, if you wanted to reduce congestion and accidents and pollution, what you're going to have to do is get private decision makers, drivers, to actually take account of social costs. And you can do that by a higher tax on gasoline. I know as consumers we're not excited about that idea, but if you just think about if we're trying to reduce all of those negative externalities, in Europe, has anyone traveled to Europe and seen the gas prices over there? How much, do y'all remember how much it was? €4 gallon?
Yeah, and when you think about it, it's more expensive.
When I was over there, it was $2.60, $2.70, but that was a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But it was almost double what our cost was.
And and that's why they're trying to reduce those negative externalities. Okay, another way that we could another option that we have in terms of public policy towards externalities is a market-based policy. So instead of having the government tell you what to do or maybe tax you, to have something like tradable pollution permits. And this is kind of neat. What we're doing is creating a market to buy and sell pollution permits. I'll show you an example. Okay, so let's say that our Environmental Protection Agency says that in this community, in the city, 900 units of pollution is the limit. It's the maximum if we're, they've looked at the health of people in the community and pollution, and they figured out 900 units is the limit. Okay, well, let's just pretend that we've got 3 companies in this city. Okay, company A, B, and C. So, if 900 units, we could say that each company is allowed to pollute how many units, or release how many units of pollution? 300, right? That's their limit. Well, let's just pretend that company A is newer, it's a newer factory, and they've got better technology, and so they only pollute 100 units. Let's pretend that company B is an older factory, and they're just releasing lots of units out there of pollution. Okay, company C. is right there at the limit, so they're okay. Now, what are we doing here? In terms of what they're allowed to pollute, Company A has, you can think of it as like 200 units of extra pollution that they're allowed to pollute, but they aren't right now because they've got this better technology, right? And so what they could do is maybe sell 200 units of pollution to Company B. So that Company B could buy that from Company A. And so they're going to be at their level plus these 2 units that they've bought from Company A. A can make some money off of B, and then would we still have the limit? Would we still be under the limit of what the EPA said? Yes. So instead of the government having to get involved and tax and regulate and make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to, they could leave it up to the market and have companies solve the problem. In Chicago, they have a lot of, they do this, and in New York, they've got this regional greenhouse gas initiative. So they actually do this in other cities. I think you'll have everything here, right? Okay. This figure just shows if we were to, set a price on pollution. So, in theory, you could pollute as much as you wanted if you as long as you wanted to pay for that tax, or we could set a supply of pollution permits. Your author's just saying either way you go about solving the problem of trying to reduce pollution, you can come up with the same outcome. You can still meet that goal either way. It's okay. A couple other points that your author wanted to make. Some people don't like the idea of pollution permits or giving anybody the right to pollute for a fee. But your author says, or actually any economist will say, but, we're always going to have some pollution. It's not like we're ever going to get to zero pollution. If you're going to turn on a car or drive it, there's going to be some pollution there. And so we always have to think of the trade-offs. Yes, we want clean air and clean water, but that's something else is going to have to give. And we see that richer countries can afford a cleaner environment, and so it is a normal good. So that has that plays a role. That's a factor also. And if we want the cleanest that we can get in terms of taking into account our trade-offs, then economists think that pollution permits and taxes are the way to go rather than regulating businesses' behavior. We also have some private solutions to externalities. So without getting the government involved, we could have moral codes. We've all seen the billboards up saying, don't mess with taxes, right? Or having maybe tax deductions for charities that do help clean up the side of the road. Your author mentions maybe a beekeeper in an apple orchard if those owners of if those properties were adjacent to each other, if they could enter a contract and make sure that there were enough trees for the bees to pollinate, to make honey. There are some things that private businesses can do where they're both better off. And there's actually a theory that goes along with that. In the DVD, the professor said he and his neighbor, there's this, piece of property between them, and they're kind of arguing over who's going to mow it. If private parties can figure out and solve that problem, then that's going to be great because we don't need the government to get involved. But sometimes private solutions don't always work. In the movie with Aaron Brockovich, for example, Pacific Gas and Electric was so big, and they were paying off doctors, and it took a lot to fight them. Just people in the community, just alone, you wouldn't have enough power to do so. But it took a law firm to do it. So sometimes their bargaining doesn't work, and then the negotiation process breaks down, and then you would need the government to step in. But for things like neighbors, I had a neighbor who, and it's just kind of an empty lot there. They don't live there, and they rented it out to someone, and this guy brought a dog over and just left the dog there. He would come by and feed it once or twice, but he wouldn't scoop the poop. I would worry about the dog when there was a big storm. Sometimes he would come and get it, and every time I thought about reporting them, he would have the dog take it away. But you think of all the, I actually had to get, the poor dog was just scratching all the time. And every time we mentioned something to them, he would address it, only when we mentioned it. And I had to get new flea medicine for my dogs because that old medicine didn't even work anymore. And it was awful just to see my dog suffering too. So thinking about negative externalities and the flies that were all around our yard because of his, so sometimes the co-steering works, sometimes we can talk to our neighbors and work it out ourselves, but sometimes we have to report and get the government involved. And I ended up not having to. I think our neighbor on the other side did, so I don't see them anymore. Okay, that's the end of Chapter 10.